All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. I'm actually senior cloud advocate now. That changed just a couple of months ago. And I'm inside of Microsoft Cloud and AI with a real focus in on connecting with students and really around web dev. And so that's what leads me here today to talk about probably my favorite product that we've shipped since Visual Studio Code, or maybe even since the new Windows terminal, just to try and keep it with everything else. Which I have to say, I personally use the terminal and absolutely love it. That and WSL are just fantastic. But in any event, let's get in and talk about Azure Static Web Apps. So I want to get in and talk about what it is, why to use it, how it works, and then we'll just get in and actually do the thing. So what is Azure Static Web Apps? Well, in marketingese, it's from code to global scale in minutes. Okay, that's great. But how about in something other than marketingese? How about in something that makes a little bit more sense? So let's talk about modern web dev. So modern web dev is typically not going to involve, or I shouldn't say typically, but quite frequently isn't going to involve the monolithic applications of the past that going in and creating like full projects all in like one huge thing and I'm deploying this out to my server. That's not typically how we wind up doing things in a lot of newer projects that we're putting out there. That quite frequently what we're doing is we're taking advantage of these really cool front-end frameworks and letting them do the logic, letting them do a lot of the lifting, and then we have some back-end services that are then going to be there to support them. So a lot of times I might have some services that I've written, I've got some other services that maybe I'm going out and calling, and my application then winds up just orchestrating all of those together. And so I'm using then cool front-end frameworks like Angular or React or Vue or my personal favorite, Svelte. I'm a huge fan of Svelte. And if you don't mind a shameless plug for Web Wednesday, a little bit later on this afternoon, 3 p.m. Pacific, I'll actually be hosting another show talking about Svelte. I'm a huge fan of it. But this is a lot of how we do modern web dev. So what we want to be able to do then is to build those and host those out, what are sometimes called static web apps. You might also have heard of them as full stack applications. That's quite commonly the more popular term that you'll hear. So we want to be able to build and host those. But we also want to help streamline some of the more difficult processes that we have in hosting web applications, in writing web applications. And that's certainly going to involve authentication and authorization. Any web developer that has ever tried to start writing their own code for authentication and authorization knows the struggle that this can be. I think Django does probably the best job of this of any of the open source frameworks. But after that, this can really be tricky. So what's really cool about Azure Static Web Apps is that this is built right in. Because after all, if you're creating a web app, you're almost certainly going to need some level of authentication authorization. And this is going to be baked right in without me actually having to do anything to enable Twitter authentication, GitHub authentication, or Azure Active Directory. And if what you want to be able to do is not inside of those three, you can also bring your own authentication as well if you need to. Your APIs that are going to be running on the server are going to be powered by Azure Functions. And if you're not familiar with Azure Functions is the serverless component of Azure, and it's designed to automatically scale and grow and also be extremely cost effective, which you're also going to see applies into Azure Static Web Apps as well, that most everything, most of the cool features are actually free inside of Static Web Apps, and that the paid for gives you a couple of like cool enterprise things, but for a lot of the apps that you're going to build, you're going to notice that that's going to be available for free. And then finally, last but not least, is CICD powered by GitHub Actions. Meeting developers right where they are, because chances are you're hosting your code inside of GitHub. So why reinvent things? Let's just build this right on top of GitHub. And so that's what's happened. And so what you'll see when we get in to actually do the deployment is we're going to have a GitHub repository. And inside of here, we're going to have two main folders. One that's going to host whatever our front end is, and then one that's going to host our back end or our API. We're then going to push that up into our main branch or maybe PR into it. And when that happens, an action will then execute to deploy all of that out to static web apps. So we'll have our static content. That's going to be all the HTML, JavaScript, CSS. We're going to have our API inside of Azure Functions. And all of that is wrapped up inside of this neat little package called Static Web Apps. Let's actually do the thing. Let's actually bring this together and actually do it. So there's the last little bit of marketing, and let's get in and do the demo here. So give me just 2 seconds, boop, boop, and then I'm going to share out my browser window. Boop, boop, boop. Here we go. Okay. That should be, there we go, perfect. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do, is I'm gonna paste this into the private chat so that way if, Simon, you wanna share this out, that's perfect. This is the repository that I'm going to use for all of my demo here. So this is a little workshop that I've built for Azure Static Web Apps. And what you're going to notice is that there's like some step-by-step instructions on how to actually go through everything, the various tooling that you're going to need, and so forth. But the real thing that I'm interested in here is inside of here, we have a React app that's already built. So let's go in and take a look at this. I'm just going to open up my source folder here. And what you're going to notice is inside of my little index, there's kind of the core React where we're then going to load up our little app component, and then we're going to tell that to render. If I open up that app component, boop, 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 what you're then going to notice is we're going to use one other component here called dog list. And then I've got a little bit of code here to do the update I've got a little bit of code here for my dog list. If you want to add a message later, you can. I'll get to that in a second. But there is that. And then my dog list, JSX, this is now going to do a little bit of work to display out a list of dogs here. So I've got my code that's then going to load everything up. And then down below is the display. So all of this is like core React. Now, don't worry too much if you're not overly familiar with React. That's not the purpose of the demo. That's not the goal here. If you haven't done React, if you're only using vanilla.js, or maybe you're using another framework and you're just not familiar with React, don't focus in on that. The reason that I chose React is just because it was what I chose when I wrote this out. But everything that I'm going to be demoing will work with Svelte or Vue or Angular or whatever other framework it is that you happen to be using. So don't worry too much at all about the React if you're not overly familiar with it. Okay. So there's the React side. And then let me open up the API side. Yeah. So here is my little Azure function. And if I open this up, what this is then going to do is return out the list of dogs, Sammy, Roscoe, Artichoke. That's going to return all of that back from my server. Now, obviously, you could go ahead and load this from a database. In fact, typically that's what you would do. I wanted to just keep this a little bit easier, so I'm not calling out to a database. This is just hard-coded right into here. Now, if you're not familiar with Azure Functions, Azure Functions gives you the ability to, well, create a function that's then going to be hosted inside of Azure Serverless. Now, the way that this works, the core thing that we have here is this context object. Now, this context object is going to give you access to everything that's going on with the request. So I can, for example, log things out. I can get the actual request object. So if there was anything in the body that was being sent up, I could then read that. And then you'll also notice that there's a little res property here, that's our response, where I can then build up the response. So you'll notice that I'm putting together a body, it's going to have an array of dogs, and then there is the list of all of the items. In my case, this is a JavaScript array, but this could also be full objects if you wanted to. So if I'm like using a Mongo database and I'm grabbing objects and I want to just send those out, I can absolutely do that. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form limited to primitive types here, that this will automatically serialize it and then send it on down, which is pretty cool. Okay, so there's my little application, there's my little project. Now, if you wanted to follow along, you could then go ahead and fork the repository. I apparently didn't set this up as a template. Let me do that real quick. Template repository, there we go. That should have been done already. Okay, cool, yeah. There we go. Yeah, so now you've got use this template. That's really what you'd want to be able to do. So if you hit that, it'll give you the opportunity to then just make a copy of that, and away you could go from there. In my case, I've actually already got this open inside of Visual Studio Code Spaces. Visual Studio Code Spaces gives you Visual Studio Code just inside the browser. And actually, I should say GitHub Code Spaces, because that's really where it is. So this is actually just fully code spaces. So or fully Visual Studio Code. So I can even like install extensions and do all sorts of things. I can, go in and start modifying my code. I get the full IntelliSense. It will actually sync all of my settings with my local Visual Studio Code and so forth. So all really cool stuff here. So I've got all of that right here. Now, the main reason that I'm using Visual Studio Code is just to make my life a little bit easier when it comes to doing the deployment. Now, I could go into the Azure portal to do this, but I really like to use the extension. So what I want to do is deploy my site out to Azure Static Web Apps. So if you go into the extensions marketplace, do a real quick search for Azure Static Web Apps, boop, there it is. Sound effects help, by the way. And then you could go ahead and install it. I've already got it installed, which is why my button says uninstall. But I could go ahead and install it. And now, if I go into my little Azure section, it's then going to prompt me to sign in. I've got my functions up here. I really want my static web app, so let me click sign in. And boop. I can now close the window. Well, thank you. There we go. Okay, so now let me hit the little plus here that says create a static web app. And I'm going to choose my Visual Studio subscription. And it now needs to go, hey, do you want to authorize GitHub to work with this? And the reason for that is, again, going back to the slides, all of this is built around GitHub. So this is actually going to set up an action inside of my GitHub repository. So let me click continue there and hit continue there. I can now close the window. Again, hooray. There we go. All right. And I don't know why it thinks I have working changes, but let me just go ahead and commit them. And I'm also just going to do a real quick git push. Okay. All right. So now, okay. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. I wasn't expecting that message, so it threw me for a second. You know what I'm going to do? I'm actually just going to back this up and do this one more time here. Okay, so I hit the little plus to add. Now, if you haven't already authenticated for GitHub, like you saw, it will then prompt me at that point. I've now done that. So now it's going to say, okay, well, what subscription do you want to use? So I'm going to choose Visual Studio Code. Now it's going to go, okay, well, what would you like to name this static web app? So I'm going to say Cloud Summit Demo because I'm very creative in my naming. Let me hit enter here. And now it's going to ask me to choose a region. And this is a little bit interesting because it makes it kind of look like this is going to be deployed out to one region and one region only. And that's actually not the case. What's amazing, or one of the amazing things about Azure Static Web Apps is that you will automatically get geo-replication. It will automatically do that. There's literally nothing that I have to do to enable that geo-replication. So now when somebody goes to hit my website, they're actually going to hit a server that's closer to them. That's pretty slick. And again, I don't have to do anything for that. So the location that it's asking me for here is really sort of where I want my initial deployment to go. And if I decide to set up any staging environments, where those will reside. So you will want to choose something that's close to you, but keep in mind that the production site is going to be globally deployed, which is really slick. So I'm going to choose West US 2. And now it's going to ask me, okay, well, do you want to use a preset here? And it gives me things like Blazor and Vue.js. And if you're using maybe a static site generator like Gatsby, Hugo, or VuePress, it will give you those. Or if you are maybe using some form of a hodgepodge, you're doing different things and kind of putting them all together, then you could just go ahead and choose custom. And that's actually what I'm going to choose here. So I'm going to choose custom. It will then ask me where the root of all of my code is. That's going to be inside a /, so the root. And then it's going to ask me, okay, well, what is the name of the output for all of your JavaScript, CSS, and HTML? Again, when we think about modern web dev, long gone are the days of just writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and having that deploy, although many would argue, and I think rightly so, that we should probably start to bring some of that back. That instead, the way that we do development these days is we use a framework, that we use Angular or we use, we use Vue. And we're then writing in a language that the browser isn't able to understand. So we now need to convert that into something that the browser can understand. And during that build process, it's then going to create a directory. So in my case, that's going to be called build. So you would put in whatever that is here. So I'm going to hit enter. And now it's going to deploy all of that up. And so you'll notice it gives me a little button right here where I can open my actions here, and I can actually see it deploying out. So I can now see it doing its thing. And if I go to the Azure portal here, and let me go to, where do I want to be? I want where are my resource groups? All resources, and this might just take it a second here. What did I call it? Summit? There we go. Okay, there's my little static web app. Just had to go find it real quick. Okay, so here it is inside of Azure. And there's a couple of real quick things that I want to highlight while this is doing its deployment. First of all, is under environment. So this was the thing that I was kind of teasing earlier about having staging environments. That every time that you create a pull request into that main branch, it will then set up a staging environment. So if you need to do any last minute testing, this will then support that, which is pretty darn cool. The other big thing is if I go under configuration here, if you need like connection strings, I can then put all of those right inside of here. And those are then read out using process.env, which is what you would do typically. The last little thing that I want to highlight, let me just go back to the overview here, is you'll notice the URL is red moss and then a hex value. So it's not that Cloud Summit demo name that I set up, it's this right here. And there's honestly good reason for that, because one of the challenges that we wind up running into is a lot of naming clashes. So it will just generate this for you. Now, if you don't like this, and I don't blame you, you'll notice right here is custom domains, and then I could add in a brand new custom domain here. So if you go in, you register your domain, this will then walk you through that whole process. Now, I think I've stalled long enough for my workflow to have completed. Yep, the light is green, the trap is clean, everything is deployed. So let me go back over here, click that little link, and voila, this is now deployed out. And so all that I did was just kind of walk through a real quick wizard, and that then deployed everything out. Now, just to highlight how we could potentially do changes, is if I go to, let's just say, my app.jsx, and let's add in a message, and let's say H2, this is my update, and let's just save that, git commit am made a change, and then git push. That will now deploy out. And if I had created a new branch, I could then PR into that main branch, and that would then give me a new staging environment. But now behind the scenes, and I could actually go in and take a look here, we're going to see that deploying out. And that's really it. So that is Azure Static Web Apps. So what we saw there was how we could take a React project and how we could deploy that out to Static Web Apps. So it was already on GitHub. We'd already had that. So we just went into our Visual Studio Code, installed that Static Web Apps extension, and then we hit plus and walked through the wizard to manage that installation. So there is Azure Static Web Apps. And I believe that that's 25 minutes and 5 minutes for Q&A.